Surveillance Log, Imperial Archives, Station VALTHIS 9. Timestamp 347.22/cycle 1188/3rd era. Flagged incident: unauthorized access to the Grand Computational Hall by maintenance personnel. Security override not triggered. No damage reported. Classification pending review. Note: Station Prefect Doron. What follows in the official record does not explain what happened. The surveillance footage does. I have watched it 11 times. The mop bucket had a broken wheel. Marin Koss had reported it twice through the station's maintenance request system, and twice the system had kicked it back with the same automated reply: non-critical repair. Estimated queue time: 43 standard cycles. So she wedged a folded rag under the axle housing and kept dragging the bucket across the marble floors of VALTHIS 9, the seat of the Orenthali Empire's oldest academy of computation, the place where 17 of the most decorated mathematical scholars in 3-star systems had gathered to solve the lattice proof. They had been at it for 2 years. Marin had been mopping around them for 11 months, ever since her transfer from the lower maintenance pool on Deck 40. She had not asked for the transfer. A staffing algorithm had assigned her upward because no one else wanted the Grand Hall shift. The scholars worked odd hours. They left crystallized tea residue on surfaces that cost more than her annual salary to refinish. They complained to station management if the cleaning solvent smelled too strong within 50 meters of their work. 3 previous janitors had requested reassignment within the first month. Marin stayed. She kept the solvent concentration low. She kept the floors dry. She emptied the crystalline waste bins before they overflowed into the gutter channels beneath the scholars' floating desks, and she kept her eyes on the equations. She could not help it. The Grand Computational Hall was a cathedral of hovering light. The Orenthali did not use screens or paper. They computed in luminous suspension, each equation a 3-dimensional lattice of pale blue symbols rotating slowly above long crystalline tables. The notation was a variant of Orenthali Base 12 symbolic logic, derived from their species' native pattern language, and it was considered one of the most complex mathematical frameworks in known space. Marin had taught herself to read it in 4 months. Not because anyone had shown her. The cleaning staff's data terminal carried maintenance manuals, shift schedules, and a single approved entertainment channel that played Orenthali ceremonial music on a loop. She had learned it the way she had learned everything since she was 12 years old. By watching, by remembering, by turning the symbols over in her mind during the long, quiet stretches when the scholars were asleep, and she was alone with their work, her mop moving in slow circles beneath equations that floated like frozen starlight. She had always been like this. Back on Earth, before she had signed a labor contract with the Orenthali Territorial Exchange and shipped out to the far side of the spiral arm, she had been a maintenance worker at a community college in a small coastal town called Shearwater. She cleaned lecture halls and seminar rooms. She emptied trash cans next to whiteboards covered in calculus, organic chemistry, theoretical physics. She had never taken a class. She had never enrolled. She had dropped out of secondary school at 16 to help her mother, and she had not gone back. But she had stood in those empty rooms at midnight, reading the boards, and the numbers had always made sense to her in a way that words never quite did. The patterns were there, clear as tide lines on sand. She never told anyone. There was no one to tell. She was 43 years old. Her hair was going gray at the temples. Her hands were rough from decades of industrial cleaning agents. And she had signed a 7-year off-world labor contract because the pay was 3 times what she could earn on Earth, and she was sending money home to her sister's 3 kids. She did not think of herself as smart. She thought of herself as someone who noticed things. And she had noticed 3 weeks ago that the scholar's proof had a gap. It sat in the 7th lattice layer, a place where two subproofs were supposed to converge into a unified resolution. The convergence point required a particular identity, a relationship between two sets of recursive functions, and the scholars had been circling it for months, trying approach after approach, each one collapsing under the weight of an instability they could not locate. Marin had watched every attempt. The first had been Scholar Taven's. He held the Pellerin Chair of Recursive Theory at the Imperial Academy, the youngest holder in 2 centuries, and he had spent 4 months constructing an elaborate detour around the convergence point. A substitute pathway that avoided the instability by rerouting through a higher dimensional transform. It had been elegant work. Marin had watched it take shape night after night as she mopped beneath it, the symbols cascading through the lattice like a waterfall folding back on itself. She had admired the craftsmanship even as she felt the wrongness humming beneath it, a faint vibration in the mathematics, like a string tuned a quarter tone flat. It failed in week 14. The higher dimensional transform collapsed under its own recursive weight and pulled 2 adjacent layers down with it. 3 weeks of cascading corrections followed. Taven had stood at the lattice for 9 minutes after the final collapse, perfectly still, his sharp features locked in the Orenthali expression that Marin had learned to read as controlled fury. Then he had dismantled the failed pathway symbol by symbol, as methodically as a surgeon closing a wound, and left the hall without speaking to anyone. The second attempt had been Scholar Morthai's. She was young, younger than most of the others, with pale blue-gray skin and a nervous energy that showed in her hands. She had proposed a brute force numerical approximation that bypassed the convergence point entirely. The other scholars objected on theoretical grounds. Morthai argued, with increasing frustration across 2 weeks of debate, that an approximate solution was better than no solution. Prefect Seon finally allowed her to try. The approximation produced a result accurate to 4 decimal places, but diverged catastrophically in the 5th, generating a cascade of nonsense values that contaminated the entire 7th layer and took 6 days to clean out. Morthai published a secondary paper on the failure mode, received a citation from the Academy, and quietly filed for reassignment. Her desk sat empty now, its crystalline surface gathering dust that Marin wiped every morning. The third attempt had been a collaborative effort, 6 scholars working together on what they called the braided method. They split the convergence point into 12 parallel subconvergences and attempted to weave them back together at a higher layer. It was the most ambitious of the approaches. Marin watched it build for weeks, the 6 scholars moving through the lattice in practice coordination, their hands tracing symbols in concert like musicians playing the same difficult score. She found it beautiful. She also knew by the end of the 3rd week that it was going to fail, because the subconvergences inherited the same instability as the parent convergence. They were not 12 new problems. They were 12 copies of the same problem, each one carrying the same invisible flaw. The braided method unraveled in week 11. 1 subconvergence failed, then another, then 4 at once, the collapse spreading through the lattice like cracks through ice. The 6 scholars worked for 36 hours straight trying to stabilize the remaining threads. They did not succeed. When it was over, Scholar Hathivran, a senior Orenthali with iron-gray skin and a reputation for diplomatic understatement, said only, "The instability is fundamental. We are not fighting a technical problem. We are fighting something structural that we cannot see." He was exactly right. Marin heard him say it from the southeast corner of the hall where she was emptying a waste bin. She wanted in that moment to walk across the marble floor and say, "I can see it. It is in the 3rd layer. It is a sign error. Let me show you." She emptied the waste bin and moved to the next one. The 4th attempt had been Taven's again, a modified version of his original pathway, stripped down and rebuilt with additional constraints meant to absorb the recursive instability before it could cascade. He worked on it alone, staying in the hall until 200 most nights, his sharp features drawn with the particular intensity of someone who believes the answer is personal. Marin mopped around him on those late nights. He never acknowledged her presence. She was ambient. She was the sound of water and the smell of cleaning solvent. But she watched his modified pathway take shape, and she saw the moment in the fourth week when it hit the same wall, the same instability, the same impossible convergence that could not close because the same sign error was feeding it the wrong information from 4 layers down. Taven stared at the wall for 20 minutes. Then he deleted his work, not dismantled it carefully the way he had the first time, deleted it. A single gesture that wiped 6 weeks of computation. He looked, for one moment, like a man beginning to doubt himself. Then the expression vanished and the careful neutrality returned, and he walked out with his hands clasped behind his back. Marin mopped the space where he had stood. The marble was warm from his feet. The 5th attempt had been Scholar Rental's, submitted remotely from the Pellerin Institute, a theoretical framework that promised to redefine the convergence conditions by recasting the problem in a different mathematical basis. Ilara spent 2 weeks implementing it. The framework came close. It skirted the 3rd layer. It almost touched the boundary coefficient. If it had been oriented slightly differently, Rental's approach would have exposed the mismatch directly. But it was oriented the standard way, through the secondary frame, and it sailed past the error without seeing it. The result? A new instability identical to the original, displaced by exactly 1 layer. Ilara sat at her desk for a long time after that. She did not delete anything. She just sat, silver hair falling across her face, luminous eyes fixed on the lattice. Marin saw what the other scholars did not. The lead scholar was beginning to consider that the proof could not be solved. The 6th attempt was the hybrid approach, a recombination of previous failures. Elements of the braided method stitched to Taven's modified pathway, reinforced with constraints from Rental's framework. The work of a group running out of approaches and recycling old ones. The 3rd human, a quiet man with dark skin and a calm, measuring way of looking at things, had not spoken at all. During the military question, he had been examining the junction between the wall panel and the ceiling with an expression of mild professional interest, the way a physician might look at an interesting rash on a stranger. The 4th, a woman of medium build who carried herself with the economical movement of someone accustomed to tight spaces, had said only, "No thank you," when offered the standard diplomatic refreshment. She had spent most of the interview looking at the ventilation grill above the doorway with her head tilted at a slight angle, as if she were listening to something behind the metal. Core filled 3 pages of classification notes. The portrait that emerged was clear. A species of modest capability, limited ambition, no strategic significance, and an almost aggressive indifference to the gravity of the situation. He had seen it before. Most species below a C10 threshold didn't fully understand what the evaluation meant. They shuffled through the process, received their tier assignment, and spent the next century quietly occupying whatever marginal niche the confederated systems allotted them. "I have sufficient data for a preliminary classification," Core said, closing the session. "You will be notified of the result within 2 rotations." The gray-haired woman stood. She hadn't given her name and Core hadn't asked for it. He realized this only later and it would bother him. "There's a coupling joint in your station's atmospheric processor that's about to shear," she said, nodding toward the far wall. "Probably 8 hours before you lose pressure in the lower ring. Might want to look at that." Core didn't look at the wall. The station's maintenance systems are automated and functioning within normal parameters. "Sure they are." The humans left. The quiet man paused in the doorway and tilted his head, listening to something. He placed one hand flat against the doorframe, held it there for a moment, then followed the others without a word. Suvin looked at Core. "What was that?" "Irrelevant," Core said. "File the behavioral anomaly under sensory fixation. It's consistent with low-complexity neural mapping." Core filed the preliminary report that evening. Classification: C7 inert passive. Primary function, manual maintenance unverified. Strategic value, none. Recommended integration, labor pool allocation, supervised. He attached the spectral data, the cognitive index estimates, and the behavioral transcript. He flagged the report as routine. He sent it to the council's central archive with the expectation that no one would read it for at least a month. He ate his evening meal, reviewed the schedule for the Vormathi delegation's intake the next day, and allowed himself a brief moment of satisfaction at the efficiency of the day's work. 409 species classified in his career. Every one correctly categorized on the first assessment. His record was unblemished. Before retiring, he opened the preliminary file one more time and reread his concluding recommendation. Labor pool allocation, supervised. He considered the gray-haired woman's warning about the coupling joint and felt a small, dismissive flicker of amusement. Every low-tier species had something they wanted to seem important about. The Dranathi had insisted their atmospheric singing could predict solar flares. The Kellocs had claimed their third stomachs could process raw uranium. Both had been classified correctly, and both had spent the decade since performing exactly the labor their tiers predicted. He closed the file and went to sleep with the comfortable certainty of a man whose system had never failed him. 6 hours later, the coupling joint in the atmospheric processor sheared. Core was in his quarters when the pressure alarm sounded. It was a hard, flat sound, the kind that cut through sleep and left the body standing before the mind caught up. He reached the operations center in 90 seconds and found 2 of his analysts already there, staring at the diagnostic board with expressions he recognized as controlled panic. "Lower ring is venting," Sovan said. "The automated repair system engaged, but it's cycling a patch protocol for a Type 4 breach, and this is a Type 7. Override it." "I tried. The system doesn't have a Type 7 template in its library. It's trying to apply the Type 4 patch in a loop. Every cycle it fails, resets, and tries again." The diagnostic board blinked red in a steady rhythm. Core watched it pulse 3 times while he processed what Sovan had said. "Get station maintenance on comms." "Station maintenance is automated. There's no crew." "Then get whoever built this station." That was the Recallion Consortium. They went insolvent 11 years ago. Their technical archive, their engineering specifications. Sold to a debt recovery firm, the firm was dissolved. The records were classified as unclaimed and placed in a storage facility on Recall 7, which has since been repurposed as a fuel depot. Core stood in the operations center and watched the lower ring's atmospheric pressure drop at a rate that his training told him was recoverable for approximately 40 more minutes. After that, the ring would need to be sealed and evacuated. There were 62 personnel in the lower ring, including a delegation from the Vormathi Collective who were waiting for their own evaluation and who would certainly file a diplomatic complaint if they were asphyxiated. He thought about the gray-haired woman pointing at the far wall. 8 hours, she'd said. It had been 6. "Where are the humans?" Core asked. Sovan looked at him. "The 4 from the intake. Where are they quartered?" "Lower ring, Section 9. "In the section that's venting." "Yes." Core ordered a security team to Section 9. He told himself it was standard protocol to locate all non-essential personnel during an emergency. He did not tell himself that he was hoping the gray-haired woman might know something about coupling joints. The security team found the humans in the corridor outside their quarters. They were not panicking. They were not moving toward the evacuation points. The gray-haired woman was kneeling beside an access panel in the corridor wall with the canvas bag beside her, its contents spread on the floor in a precise arrangement that looked deliberate in a way Core's security team couldn't articulate. The youngest of the 4 was holding a light. The other 2 were running cable from a junction box 20 meters down the corridor. "What are you doing?" the security team leader asked. "Fixing it," the gray-haired woman said without looking up. This is an active emergency. You need to evacuate to the upper ring. If I evacuate to the upper ring, you lose the lower ring. If I stay here, you lose about 4 minutes of your schedule. She reached into the wall with a tool the security team leader didn't recognize. Your choice. The security team leader, a Thivon officer named Dren who had 18 years of station duty and a deep institutional aversion to surprises, stood in the corridor and watched the gray-haired woman do something inside the wall that produced a sound like a bone being set. The quiet man handed her a length of cable without being asked. The fourth human was 3 meters away, pressed against a second access panel with her ear to the metal, eyes closed, fingers moving in a slight pattern as if she were counting something no one else could hear. 12 minutes later, the pressure alarm stopped. Not wound down, not gradually diminished, stopped, clean and total like a conversation ended mid-sentence. Core received the report in the operations center. The diagnostic board showed the atmospheric processor's coupling joint as repaired, not patched, not bypassed, not temporarily stabilized. Repaired. The fault line was gone. The system was running at 97% efficiency, which was 3% higher than its pre-failure baseline. How, Core said. The humans fixed it, Sovan said. With what? The security team's report says she used a hand tool of unknown configuration and approximately 3 meters of cable from their personal luggage. The cable appears to be standard insulated copper wire of a type manufactured on their homeworld. Copper wire? Yes. They repaired a Type 7 atmospheric breach with copper wire. And a hand tool of unknown configuration. Core looked at the diagnostic board for a long time. Then he looked at his preliminary classification report, which was still open on the adjacent screen. C7 inert passive. He did not close it yet. Closing it would mean something he was not ready to acknowledge. Get me the station's full maintenance log, he said. The maintenance log was 600 pages of automated entries. Core had never read it in full. The pre-assessment review protocol required him to check the executive summary, which confirmed that all primary systems were operational. He had checked the summary. It had confirmed. He had moved on. That was the process. But buried in the routine entries were anomalies that the executive summary did not surface. Not because the summary was defective, but because the anomalies fell below the threshold the summary was designed to flag. They were not failures. They were degradations. Slow, accretive, incremental declines that had been accumulating for years, the way silt accumulates in a riverbed. The atmospheric processor's coupling joint was simply the first failure to reach a critical threshold. The water recycler's filtration membrane was operating at 61% efficiency. The docking bay's magnetic clamps were drawing 14% more power than their rated capacity. The gravity plating in the upper observation deck had a harmonic oscillation that was imperceptible to anyone standing on it but visible in the power consumption data. The thermal regulation in the medical bay had a 2-degree variance that cycled every 40 minutes. The communications array was compensating for a misaligned receiver dish by boosting signal power, which was draining the backup power reserve at a rate that would empty it in approximately 112 days. Core read the log and felt something he rarely felt, which was the sensation of having been professionally insufficient. Not wrong. The data supported his classification, but insufficient in a way that the data could not measure. He went to Section 9 himself. He did not bring Sovan. He did not bring a security escort. He walked through the lower ring, which smelled faintly of ozone from the recent repair, and found the gray-haired woman sitting outside her quarters on a supply crate, drinking something from a dented metal container. I read the maintenance log, he said. Figured you might. There are 17 additional systems operating outside nominal parameters. 19, she said. 2 of them aren't in the automated log because the sensors that monitor them failed 3 years ago and the system reclassified them as decommissioned. Your ventral heat exchange and the secondary water reclamation loop. Both still running, both limping. Core absorbed this. He had not known those systems were still active. The station's own monitoring system had not known those systems were still active. You saw all of this during the intake walkthrough. We saw most of it from the docking bay. The atmospheric processor was loud enough to hear. Chen noticed the magnetic clamp overcorrection from the way our shuttle drifted during final approach. Okonkwo felt the gravity oscillation through the deck plating the moment he stepped off the ramp. Mara caught the thermal variance walking down the first corridor, said the air tasted warm on the left side and cool on the right. She took a drink. The rest we picked up on the walk to the evaluation chamber. In the corridors. Corridors tell you everything about a station. The sound the deck plates make under your feet. The way the air tastes when the recycler isn't quite right. Whether the lighting flickers at a regular interval, which means a programmed cycle, or a random one, which means a power draw conflict somewhere upstream. Core had walked those same corridors every day for 2 years. He had noticed nothing. The hum of the station had been background noise to him, the way the color of the sky was background to a ground dweller. Your classification report, he said carefully. It may require revision. You think, I would like to conduct a secondary assessment, a practical evaluation of your capabilities. The gray-haired woman looked at him. Her eyes were a color he had not cataloged during the intake, a kind of weathered brown that reminded him of the ceremonial wood panels in the council's archive hall. She did not look impressed. She did not look offended. She looked like someone who had been waiting for a slow machine to finish processing, and was not in any particular hurry about it. We've got 19 broken systems, and you want to run a test first. Core opened his mouth, closed it, and then said, point taken. The work happened across the next 4 days. Core abandoned the formal evaluation protocol entirely. There was no point to it. The humans did not perform well in structured assessments because they did not take them seriously, and the data they produced in structured settings bore no resemblance to what they actually were. What they actually were became apparent one system at a time. The gray-haired woman, whose name turned out to be Vasquez, started with the water recycler. She opened the filtration housing, which required removing 8 bolts of a type that the station's own toolkit did not include a driver for. She removed them with a flat piece of metal that she had apparently been carrying in her pocket. She looked at the membrane, she touched it, she smelled it. This isn't the right membrane for your water chemistry, she said. The manufacturer specs it for low mineral feedstock, and your station is pulling water from a high mineral source. The minerals are calcifying on the membrane surface, which reduces permeability. It's been working at 60% because it was never going to work at 100, not with this design. The manufacturer's specifications indicated compatibility, Core said. The manufacturer went insolvent. You want to know why? She built a replacement membrane from materials she found in the station's cargo bay. Not from replacement parts, because there were no replacement parts. From raw materials. A roll of polymer sheeting, a container of granular carbon that had been cataloged as waste, and a bottle of solvent that was intended for surface cleaning. She fabricated a filtration medium using a process that Core's analysts could not identify from the Council's technical database, which contained the engineering methodologies of 1400 civilizations. When they asked her what she was doing, she said, "Felt right," and continued working. The recycler ran at 94% efficiency within an hour of installation. Sovan tested the output water and found that it exceeded the Confederated System's purity standard by a factor of 3. How is this possible? Sovan asked, holding the test results at arm's length as if they might be contagious. Vasquez shrugged. Water wants to be clean, you just have to stop getting in its way. The youngest human, who went by Chen, fixed the docking bay's magnetic clamps next. The problem, he explained to Soven in a tone of mild boredom, was that the clamp array's control board had a firmware error that caused it to overcalculate gravitational variance. The clamps were constantly adjusting for drift that wasn't there, like a helmsman correcting for wind on a calm day. He corrected the firmware with a handheld device that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different devices and held together with adhesive tape. The process took 40 minutes, during which Chen sat cross-legged on the docking bay floor with the device in his lap, occasionally pressing buttons and occasionally eating a piece of dried fruit that he had brought in his pocket. "Where did you get that tool?" Soven asked. "Made it." "From what?" "Stuff." "What stuff?" Chen looked at Soven with the patient expression of someone explaining arithmetic to a particularly earnest child. "A signal analyzer from an old comm unit, a frequency modulator from a broken music player, a processing chip from something I don't remember. And tape." "You built a firmware correction tool from a music player." "And a comm unit and tape. The tape is important." The clamp stabilized within an hour. Docking efficiency improved by 22%. The station's automated system logged the change as an anomaly because the improvement was outside the range of outcomes it had been programmed to expect. Soven brought the anomaly flag to Core that afternoon, holding his datapad in the slightly tilted way he held things when he was uncertain whether the information was good news or evidence of a reality he had not been prepared for. "The docking system is classifying its own improvement as a malfunction," Soven said, "because the improvement exceeds its expected parameters." "Yes, it is in effect too good to believe." Core looked at the diagnostic readout and thought about the fact that he had built his entire career on a system that was, in this specific and highly visible instance, too good to believe as well. The C7 classification had been a product of that same logic. The humans had performed below expected parameters in the intake assessment, and the system had classified them accordingly. It had not occurred to the system, or to Core, that performing below expected parameters in an assessment might simply mean the assessment was measuring the wrong things. "Flag it as resolved," Core said. "Note the cause as external technical intervention by evaluated species. That will generate questions." "Good." The third human, Okonkwo, who had said perhaps a dozen words during the entire intake interview and had not significantly increased that count since, spent 2 days in the engineering crawlways beneath the station's gravity plating. He emerged twice daily for meals and water, covered in conduit dust, and returned without comment. On the evening of the second day, he emerged for the final time and announced that the harmonic oscillation was caused by a resonance feedback loop between the gravity emitters and the structural support columns. "The emitters are positioned according to the original installation grid," he said. "But the structural columns have settled by approximately 1.7 millimeters over the life of the station, which changed the resonance profile. The emitters are now generating a standing wave that oscillates at 4.3 Hz, which is below the perceptual threshold of most species, but above the threshold of structural fatigue." "How did you determine the correct repositioning?" Core asked. "Listen to the hum." "You corrected a gravimetric resonance feedback loop by listening to it." "It's not that complicated, it's just a vibration. Everything vibrates at a frequency. You find the wrong one and you nudge it." He paused. "I moved 4 emitters approximately 2 centimeters each. It took longer to find them than to move them." 2 centimeters. Give or take." Core looked at his classification report again. C7, inert passive. The words seemed to belong to a different language, or possibly a different reality. The fourth human, Mara, who had not spoken a word that anyone had recorded since her single, "No thank you," during the intake, fixed the thermal regulation in the medical bay, the communications array alignment, the ventral heat exchange that the station's own monitoring system believed had been decommissioned, and the secondary water reclamation loop that the sensors had stopped reporting on 3 years ago. She did this without tools from the canvas bag. She used her hands, a length of conduit and what appeared to be a hairpin. Core asked her how she had repaired the communications array, which the council's own technical staff had been compensating for with a software workaround for 8 months. She looked at him for a moment, then reached up and tapped the receiver housing with one knuckle. It made a sound like a bell being struck cleanly. "Hear that?" she said. "I hear a metallic resonance. That's the housing vibrating at the correct frequency now. Before, it was loose. The vibration was diffuse, which scattered the reception pattern. I tightened it." The technical staff reported a complex misalignment requiring signal recalibration across 4 frequency bands. It was loose. Core stood beside Mara in the communications bay and considered the 8 months of software workarounds, the 17 technical memoranda, the 4 formal engineering consultations, and the proposed budget allocation for a replacement receiver dish that had been working its way through the council's procurement process. All of it rendered unnecessary by one knuckle and the knowledge that the housing was loose. He asked Mara if she had known what was wrong before she looked at it. "Heard it from the corridor," she said, "on the way in. First day. You heard a loose receiver housing from a corridor through 2 bulkheads. It was rattling, not loud, but the frequency was wrong for a secured fitting." She paused. "You get used to hearing what things should sound like. When something doesn't sound right, it stands out. And you didn't mention it. You didn't ask." He thought about the intake interview. The 4 humans sitting across the table with their sandwiches, answering his questions in monosyllables while simultaneously cataloging every system failure on the station through the sound of the air and the taste of the water and the flicker of the lights. He had been measuring them. They had been diagnosing his station. The irony was precise and uncomfortable. On the 3rd day, the Vormathi delegation's transport suffered a containment failure in its primary power coupling. The Vormathi, whose civilization held a comfortable C-14 classification, and whose technical capabilities were considered well above average by every metric the Council maintained, declared the transport inoperable and requested emergency extraction from their home fleet. Their chief engineer, a tall, crystalline-shelled individual named Torvith, delivered a detailed technical assessment explaining that the coupling's containment matrix had degraded beyond field repair capacity, and that the transport would need to be towed to a certified repair facility at considerable expense. Mara walked into the Vormathi transport's engine bay. She stood there for approximately 10 minutes, looking at the power coupling without touching anything, her head tilted slightly to one side. Then she picked up a piece of conduit from the engineering crawlway floor, bent it into a shape that no one in the room could identify or name, and inserted it into the coupling housing. The containment field stabilized. The power coupling resumed normal operation. The entire repair had taken less than 3 minutes of physical work after the 10 minutes of looking. Torvith watched this happen. Core watched Torvith's face. The crystalline shell of a Vormathi engineer did not allow for the range of facial expression that softer-skinned species enjoyed, but the way Torvith's mandibles clicked shut and stayed shut for nearly a full minute was eloquent in its own way. "Who are these people?" Torvith asked Core in the corridor afterward. "They are currently classified as C7 inert passive. I have a C14 engineering certification and a 40-year service record. I could not have done what she just did. I could not have begun to do what she just did. She used a piece of pipe. I am aware. Your classification system is broken. I am becoming aware of that. Torvith's mandibles clicked once, a sharp sound that in Vormathi body language communicated something between disbelief and professional recalibration. When you revise it, I would like to be copied on the filing. That evening, Kaur sat in his quarters and compiled the repair log. He laid out the entries chronologically, each one a small demolition charge placed beneath the foundation of his preliminary assessment. Atmospheric processor, repaired with copper wire and a hand tool. Water recycler, membrane fabricated from cargo bay waste. Magnetic clamps, firmware corrected with a device made from a music player and tape. Gravity plating, resonance dampened by listening. Communications array tightened. Thermal regulation hairpin. Vormathi C14 power coupling, a piece of pipe. He read the list 3 times. Each time, the gap between the word C7 inert passive and what the word should have said grew wider. The gap was not a mistake. It was a structural failure of the framework, as fundamental as the resonance feedback loop Okonkwo had corrected, and just as invisible to anyone who had grown accustomed to the hum. On the 4th day, Kaur retracted the preliminary report. The retraction document ran to 3 pages. This was unusual. Most retractions in the Council's history were a single paragraph, a brief administrative note that initial findings were incomplete and a revised assessment would follow. A formality. Kaur's retraction was 3 pages because he felt a professional obligation to explain, in precise taxonomic language, exactly how and why his initial assessment had been wrong. Not merely incomplete, wrong. The problem, he wrote, was not with the data. The spectral analysis was correct. The cognitive index estimates were within acceptable ranges. The behavioral transcript was accurate in every particular. The problem was with the interpretive framework itself. The Council's classification system measured capability by looking for specific markers. Hierarchical organization, declarative technical language, ceremonial displays of competence, formal credentialing, institutional knowledge repositories. The system was designed to identify these markers and assign a tier based on their presence and sophistication. It was, by every metric the Council used to evaluate its own processes, an excellent system. It had correctly classified 1,100 species over 3 centuries. The humans had none of these markers. What they had was something the classification system did not have a metric for. They could look at a broken thing and understand it. Not through analysis, not through diagnostic protocols, not through reference databases or technical manuals or institutional training. They understood broken things the way some species understood language or gravity or the social hierarchy of their hive. It was native to them, embedded. They saw the fault lines in system the way other species saw color. And they did not advertise it. They did not display it in hierarchical greeting behavior or ceremonial offerings or formal credentialing. They carried it in canvas bags with broken zippers, and they ate sandwiches during intake interviews, and they said, "We fix things," when asked about their civilization's greatest contribution, because to them, it was so obvious it barely warranted a sentence. The classification system had measured their display and found it negligible. It had not occurred to the system, or to Kaur, that a species might possess extraordinary capability and simply not feel the need to put it on show. Kaur sat in his quarters after submitting the retraction and stared at the far wall. He was not, by nature, a species given to self-recrimination. The Thivon taxonomic tradition valued precision and correction equally. Admitting error was not a failure but a recalibration. He understood this intellectually, but understanding it intellectually and feeling it in the place where professional pride lived were different operations entirely. Suvin knocked on his door. "The humans finished the remaining systems," Suvin said. "All 19. The station is operating at a higher efficiency than its original commissioning report." "Higher than when it was new?" "Yes." Vasquez said the original commissioning was, and I'm quoting, "optimistic." She also said the station was designed by committee, which she described as the engineering equivalent of a species developing vestigial organs. Core almost smiled. He didn't, because Thivon facial musculature didn't produce smiles in the way mammals understood them, but the impulse registered somewhere behind his ocular ridges. "What classification are you recommending?" Suvin asked. Core had been thinking about this for 2 days. The Council's classification system ran from C1, reserved for non-tool-using species, to C20, theoretically reserved for species capable of manipulating fundamental physical constants. No species in the current registry held a C20. The highest active classification was C17, held by the Alreni, who had built the Confederated Systems Transit Network over 4 centuries using the combined resources of 30 star systems. The humans did not build transit networks. They did not manipulate physical constants. They carried hand tools in canvas bags and corrected firmware errors with devices held together by tape. They were not impressive by any metric the Council used to measure impressiveness. They were, however, the only species in the registry that had ever looked at a station they had never seen before and diagnosed 19 hidden faults from the sound, the deck plates made during a walk down a corridor. "I'm recommending a new category," Core said. "The Council doesn't create new categories. The last one was 90 years ago. The Council has never evaluated a species that made the existing categories look insufficient." Core drafted the revised assessment the next morning. He did not use the Council's standard classification framework. He wrote a narrative assessment, which was technically within the bylaws but had not been practiced in over a century. The bylaws permitted it because the Council's founders had understood that some species would not fit neatly into a numbered tier, and that the evaluator's obligation was to the accuracy of the assessment, not to the convenience of the filing system. He spent 4 hours writing it. Normally, he could produce a species assessment in 90 minutes. This one required 4 hours because he kept stopping to find words for things the Council's taxonomic vocabulary had never needed to describe. There was no standard term for a species that diagnosed mechanical failures by taste. There was no classification code for intuitive systemic comprehension. The closest the framework came was a subcategory called Applied Technical Aptitude, which was defined as demonstrated proficiency with tools and systems within the species' own technological paradigm. The humans were not working within their own paradigm. They were working within everyone else's paradigm, and doing it better than the species who had built the paradigms in the first place. The narrative ran 12 pages. It described each repair in detail: the atmospheric processor fix, the water recycler fabrication, the firmware correction, the gravimetric dampening, the thermal regulation, the communications realignment, the ventral heat exchange restoration, the Vormathy transport repair, and the 11 other systems the humans had quietly restored to full operation during their stay. It described the tools they used, which were improvised. It described the language they used to describe their work, which was sparse and occasionally monosyllabic. And it described the manner in which they approached broken systems, which was intimate and unhurried and bore no resemblance to any diagnostic methodology in the Council's 1400 civilization technical database. Core titled the assessment, Reclassification Report, Species 7741 Homo sapiens. Original designation, C7 Inert Passive. Revised designation, pending new category Systemic Intuition, first instance. He submitted it on the morning of the 5th day. By the afternoon, he had received 412 inquiries from Council members across the Confederated Systems. 91 requested clarification on the narrative format. 67 requested additional data on the repair methodologies. 354 asked the same question in different phrasings. How did you miss this? Core answered each one with the same sentence. I used the standard framework. He meant it as a confession. Most of the recipients read it as an indictment. The difference between the two, Core reflected, depended entirely on whether you believed the framework was the problem or the person using it was. He was beginning to suspect both were correct. 3 of the inquiries came from taxonomists who had independently flagged similar anomalies in their own assessments over the years, but had been unable to articulate what was wrong. One of them, a junior researcher named Kelvith who had been stationed on a border outpost for 6 years, wrote a single line. I classified a species that could taste chemical compounds at parts per billion as C5 because they didn't have a word for laboratory. I have wondered about that filing every day since. Core read that message 4 times. Then he forwarded it to Soven without comment. The council convened an emergency review session on Tyark. 17 senior taxonomists attended in person. 43 attended remotely. Core presented the narrative assessment from the evaluation chamber, where the intake interview had taken place 5 days prior. The table still had a faint grease stain where one of the sandwich wrappers had sat. He brought the maintenance log, the diagnostic data, the before and after efficiency reports. He brought Soven's field notes, which were meticulous. He brought Torvith's unsolicited written statement, which described the Vormathy transport repair in language that a C-14 chief engineer used when professionally shaken to their crystalline foundations. He did not bring the humans, because the humans had not been invited, and Core suspected that bringing them to a room full of senior taxonomists would result in the humans eating sandwiches, while the taxonomists experienced a collective professional crisis. He judged this would not advance the discussion. He did, however, bring a piece of the conduit Mara had bent to repair the Vormathy power coupling. He placed it on the table in front of the assembled taxonomists. No one recognized what it was. No one could explain how bending a piece of standard conduit into that shape could stabilize a containment field. Core let the silence do its work for a full minute before he began his presentation. The review session lasted 3 days. The arguments were detailed and occasionally heated, not because anyone disputed the data, but because the implications of the data were profoundly uncomfortable. If the standard classification framework had missed a species this capable, what else had it missed? How many C7 inert passive filings were sitting in the archive, quietly wrong? How many species had been assigned to labor pools and supervised integration pathways who should have been assigned to something else entirely? Senior taxonomist Pren, who had written the definitive commentary on the C7 classification criteria, and whose career was substantially built on the reliability of that very tier, argued that the human's capabilities did not fit any existing tier, and that creating a new category would undermine the framework's coherence. Core agreed with the first point and disagreed with the second. Pren said the disagreement was noted. Core said being noted was insufficient. Taxonomist Yelvrin, who specialized in upward reclassifications, pointed out that in 300 years of operation, only 7 species had ever been reclassified by more than 2 tiers after initial assessment. The gap between C7 and whatever the humans actually were represented a reclassification of unprecedented magnitude in the Council's entire history. Which is why a new category is required, Core said. A new category suggests the system itself is flawed. The system classified a species capable of repairing a C14 power coupling with a piece of pipe as inert passive. If the system is not flawed, then the word flawed requires reclassification as well. The chamber went quiet after that, not because the argument was unanswerable, but because no one wanted to be the first to attempt an answer. Council Elder Emreth, who had held her seat for 40 years, and who had personally designed 12% of the current classification metrics, sat in her elevated chair throughout. She listened to 3 days of argument with an expression that Core could not read. Her face was a mask of professional composure, which in a Thivon of her seniority could mean anything from deep contemplation to the kind of institutional concern that reshaped policy for generations. When the arguments concluded, she spoke. "The framework measures what species display," she said. "It has never measured what species do when no one is measuring them." The chamber went still. Taxonomist Velthin's retraction is accepted. His revised assessment is entered into the record. A review committee will examine the existing archive for potential misclassifications. She paused, and the pause carried the weight of 4 decades of institutional authority. All 1,100 of them. Core could hear the ventilation system running, clean and even, because the humans had fixed it. After the session adjourned, Pren approached Core in the corridor outside the chamber. Pren was a Thivon of the old school, formal and precise, and his displeasure was visible in the rigid set of his dorsal ridge. "You understand what you've done," Pren said. "I corrected an error. You've called into question 3 centuries of classifications, 1,100 species, the entire framework." Core considered this. "I called into question 1 classification. The council chose to extend the inquiry. That was Elder Emreth's decision, not mine. The inquiry was inevitable the moment you submitted that retraction. You knew that." "I did. And you submitted it anyway." The alternative was to leave a species capable of systemic intuition, classified as inert passive. I could not do that and still call myself a taxonomist. Pren stood in the corridor for a long moment. The ventilation system hummed softly around them, clean and steady. "The framework served us well for 300 years. It served us adequately for 300 years. We assumed adequacy was the same as accuracy. It wasn't." Core adjusted his uniform. "If the review finds that the other 1,100 classifications are correct, then the framework will be validated more thoroughly than it has ever been. If it finds errors, then we will have corrected them. Either outcome is better than not looking." Pren's dorsal ridge relaxed by a fraction. He did not agree, not in words, but the relaxation was an acknowledgement of the argument's structural integrity, which from Pren was almost the same thing. He returned to Forward Station Tyark the following week. The station, which had been operating at declining efficiency for years, now ran as if it had been recommissioned. The air tasted different, cleaner. There was a crispness to it that he had never noticed was missing, because the degradation had been so gradual that the change had felt like the passage of time rather than the failure of a system. The deck plates under his feet did not hum. The faint arrhythmic vibration he had grown accustomed to over 2 years was gone, replaced by a silence that he now recognized had always been the correct sound. The station was not quiet. It was properly tuned. Every system running at the frequency it was designed for, producing not silence but a harmony so complete it registered as stillness. The humans were still there. They had not been assigned quarters in the upper ring, which was reserved for diplomatic personnel and evaluated species of C10 or higher. They were still in Section 9 of the lower ring, in quarters designed for maintenance staff, because that was how the station's housing allocation system had categorized them based on the C7 classification that was no longer valid but had not yet been formally replaced. Core submitted a housing reassignment request before going to find Vasquez. On his way through the lower ring, he passed Chen sitting on a corridor bench with the taped-together firmware device in his lap, eating another piece of dried fruit. Chen nodded at Core as he passed, which was the most extensive social interaction they had shared. "The secondary relay junction on Deck 4 is drawing more current than it should," Chen said, not looking up from his fruit. "Not critical, maybe 3 months before it becomes a problem." "How do you know that?" "The lights on Deck 4 flicker 1.2 seconds slower than the lights on Deck 3. That means the relay is introducing latency into the power distribution. Latency means resistance. Resistance means heat. Heat means degradation." Core stood in the corridor and absorbed the fact that a young man eating fruit on a bench had just diagnosed a system fault from the flicker rate of corridor lighting. He thought about the word C7 inert passive, and felt something that was not quite embarrassment and not quite admiration, but existed in the space between the two where professional humility lived. "I'll log it," Core said. "Appreciate it." She was in the engineering crawlway beneath the docking bay, lying on her back under a conduit junction, doing something with a wrench. The canvas bag was beside her, open, its contents arranged on the floor in the same precise configuration he had seen the night of the atmospheric breach. "I wanted to inform you that the council has accepted the revised assessment," he said. "Okay. A new classification category is being developed, the first in 90 years. It will be called systemic intuition. You are the first instance." "Good for the category." Core stood in the crawlway, which was too low for his Thivon height, and watched the woman who had dismantled his professional assumptions with a canvas bag and a wrench. She had not asked about the classification. She had not asked about the implications for her species integration pathway or diplomatic standing. She was under a conduit junction because the conduit junction needed attention, and that was sufficient reason. "It does not bother you," he said. "The initial classification." Vasquez slid out from under the junction and looked up at him. There was conduit grease on her forehead, and her hands were dark with it. She looked tired in the way that physical work made a body tired, and unworried in the way that certainty made a mind unworried, and completely at home in a space that was, by every metric his civilization used, beneath her. "You want to know if I'm angry that you called us harmless? I filed an official report classifying your species as inert and passive. I recommended supervised labor pool allocation. I did not ask for your name." "Yeah, I read the corridor." Core blinked. "You read the corridor. Your stress harmonics changed after the breach. Deck plates pick it up. More foot traffic near the operations center, different rhythm, sharper heel strikes. Someone was moving with purpose who usually moves with routine. Something went wrong with your system, and your system is the classification framework, so either someone challenged your report or you challenged it yourself." She wiped her hands on her coveralls. "I figured you'd come around. Just needed the station to do the talking for us." "You were not offended?" "By what? You looked at us, ran your numbers, got the answer your system was designed to give. That's not an insult, that's a calibration error." She picked up her wrench. "You fixed it, that's what matters." Core stood in the crawlway for another moment. He had spent 23 years as a senior taxonomist. He had classified 409 species. He had built a career on the belief that understanding was the product of data, framework, and rigorous methodology. He had never once had a subject explain his own profession to him more clearly than he could explain it himself. "Your species is remarkable," he said. "We fix things." She slid back under the junction. "Including wrong impressions, just takes a little longer." Core Velthane walked back to his quarters through corridors that sounded different than they had 2 weeks ago. He noticed it now, every step. The way his own footsteps fell on deck plates that no longer resonated with the subharmonic oscillation Okonkwo had corrected. The clean taste of air that Vasquez's membrane was filtering. The steady, uncompensated signal strength of the communications, array that Mara had fixed with a hairpin. He passed the operations center and paused. The diagnostic board showed green across every system. All 19. 20, counting the 2 the station's own monitoring system had given up on. 21, if you counted his professional assumptions. The retraction sat in the archive. 3 pages of precise, careful language explaining how a 23-year veteran of the Galactic Evaluation Council had looked at a species capable of reading the structural health of a space station by ear, and had written harmless in the classification field. He would be asked about it for years. Colleagues would reference it at conferences. Junior analysts would study it as a cautionary example in methodology courses. Pren would write a commentary. Yelvren would cite it. The retraction would become more famous than any of his 409 correct classifications, because the 409 had merely confirmed what the data already said, and the retraction had said something the data could not. And every time someone mentioned it, Cor would remember Vasquez lying under the conduit junction with grease on her forehead, explaining that his mistake was not personal. It was a calibration error, and that he had fixed it, and that fixing it was what mattered. He had filed hundreds of reports in his career, written thousands of pages of taxonomic analysis, received commendation, peer acknowledgement, professional distinctions. The 3-page retraction was the finest document he ever wrote.